November 18th, 1987. Millfield, Iowa. The first truck from Crown Industrial arrived just after sunrise. Cold wind rolled across the empty cornfields behind Eli Turner's repair shop, while 3 factory workers climbed down from the flatbed, carrying heavy steel crates, marked defective and scrap only in bright orange paint. One of them kicked open the old wooden shop door and shouted inside, "Hey, old man, where do you want this junk?" The shop smelled like diesel fuel, rust, and burnt oil. Every wall was lined with shelves packed full of gears, chasts, broken housings, bolts sorted into coffee cans, and old tractor parts most people would have thrown away years earlier. And sitting near the back beneath a dim yellow light was Eli Turner himself, 70 years old, gray beard, oil-stained gloves, still wearing the same faded brown coat he'd worn every winter for as long as anyone could remember. Eli looked up slowly from the carburetor he was rebuilding and pointed toward the far wall. The workers laughed immediately. One of them dropped a cracked hydraulic assembly onto the concrete floor just to hear it smash. "You actually keep this garbage?" he asked. Another worker smirked. "My dad says this guy still thinks machines should last forever." That brought even more laughter. Then Victor Hale stepped inside. Regional manager for Crown Industrial. Tall, clean boots, expensive coat. The kind of man who never looked at dirt unless it was through a truck window. Victor glanced around the crowded shop and shook his head with a smile. "This place looks like a museum nobody visits." The workers laughed again. Victor nudged one of the broken parts with his boot. "These components are finished," he said. "Factory rejected them months ago. Nobody can repair this stuff anymore." Eli quietly wiped his hands with a rag. Then he said something so calm it almost disappeared beneath the sound of the wind outside. "Machines usually fail long before the steel does." The room exploded with laughter. Victor grinned. "That right there is why people like you are disappearing. The world moves forward, Turner. You can't stop progress with a wrench in a junk pile." For a moment, nobody spoke. Eli didn't argue, didn't defend himself, didn't even look embarrassed. He simply stared at the damaged components lying across the floor. And there was something strange in his eyes. Not shame, recognition, as if he could already see value hidden inside things everybody else had given up on. But nobody in that shop understood what the old mechanic was really looking at. And what happened afterward became one of those stories people in Iowa still tell decades later. Because this story was never really about broken tools. It was about a man the entire town believed had fallen behind the times, until the modern world suddenly stopped working without him. Eli Turner had been born on that same property in 1917. Back then, Millfield was nothing but farmland, grain silos, and dirt roads stretching across miles of open Iowa sky. His father, Walter Turner, repaired tractors, military engines, and harvest equipment during the war before coming home with burned hands and damaged hearing. Walter taught Eli something most people had already forgotten. Never trust a man who throws things away before understanding why they broke. Eli remembered that sentence for the rest of his life. By the time he was 14, he could rebuild transmissions faster than grown men. Farmers from neighboring counties brought him damaged engines nobody else could fix because Eli listened to machines differently. He paid attention to sounds, tiny vibrations, heat patterns, metal fatigue. To him, every broken machine carried a story. But during the 1970s, everything changed. Corporate farming arrived. Banks pushed expensive equipment loans. Small family farms started disappearing one by one. And companies like Crown Industrial became powerful by selling machines farmers couldn't repair themselves anymore. Eli watched neighbors lose land their families had owned for generations because one broken system during harvest season could destroy an entire year's income. Meanwhile, Crown kept growing larger. Their equipment looked modern, computerized, expensive, and Victor Hale became the face of that future. At county fairs and equipment auctions, Victor loved giving speeches about efficiency and the end of outdated repair culture. Crowds applauded him, especially younger farmers trying desperately to survive. But Eli saw something different from inside his repair shop. He saw newer machines failing faster than older ones, specialized parts nobody local could replace, systems designed to force people back to the dealership again and again. Still, Nobody listened to the old mechanic living beside the abandoned Turner cornfield. People called him stubborn, old-fashioned, a relic. One afternoon in April of 1988, Eli attended a large equipment auction outside Millfield. Dealers, bankers, and farmers crowded around rows of new Crown harvesters, shining beneath cold spring sunlight. Victor spotted Eli standing quietly beside a damaged machine, waiting to be sold for parts. A grin spread across his face immediately. "You planning to rescue another dinosaur?" "Turner," he called out loudly. Several people laughed. Eli kept studying the cracked transmission housing without answering. Victor stepped closer. "You know what your problem is. Still nothing. You think old steel matters more than modern engineering." Now the crowd was listening carefully. Victor spread his arms toward the line of massive new harvesters. "This is the future," he announced proudly. "Precision systems, computer optimization, real technology." Then he looked directly at Eli's worn coat and grease-covered hands. "And men who spend their lives digging through scrap piles are becoming history." The laughter hit harder this time. Even some local farmers joined in. For a second, Eli stood silently beneath the cold wind, while dozens of people smirked around him. Then he bent down slowly and picked up a broken gear someone had tossed into the mud. He turned it carefully in his hand, studying it. And what Eli noticed inside that damaged piece of steel was the beginning of everything that came next. Eli brought the broken gear home that evening and placed it beneath the single lamp hanging over his workbench. Outside, winter rain tapped softly against the tin roof, while the old heater in the corner struggled to warm the shop. Most people in Millfield were asleep by then, but Eli remained awake long after midnight, turning the damaged gear slowly in his hands. Something about it bothered him. Not the crack, not the wear pattern, the steel itself. He reached for an old magnifying lens from a drawer and leaned closer. Then he stopped moving altogether. Stamped into the inner rim was a tiny marking, almost invisible beneath years of grease and rust. CX-9 prototype series. Eli had not seen that mark in nearly 20 years. And suddenly, memories came flooding back. In the late 1960s, before Crown Industrial became a giant corporation, the company had experimented with a transmission system so durable it barely needed replacement parts. Farmers who tested the early prototypes claimed the machines ran smoother, cooler, and stronger than anything else on the market. But then the project vanished. No explanation, no public release, nothing. Most people forgot it ever existed. But Eli never forgot machinery. And now one of those prototype gears was sitting in his shop, covered in mud like common scrap metal. That was the moment he realized something important. Crown Industrial had not been throwing away random broken parts. They had been discarding pieces of their own forgotten history. Over the next several months, more trucks arrived at Eli's shop. Damaged hydraulic systems, rejected drive assemblies, faulty harvest components, entire crates filled with discontinued parts the company no longer wanted stored at the factory. The workers still laughed whenever they unloaded them. One afternoon, a young engineer looked around the warehouse shelves and shook his head. "You know, none of this will ever matter." "Right." Eli kept sorting bolts without looking up. The engineer smirked. "In 10 years, every machine in this county will be fully computerized." Eli quietly slid another gear into place. "Then people better hope computers don't break." The young man laughed and walked away. But what nobody understood was that Eli had already started noticing a pattern. The newer Crown machines were failing faster every harvest season. Not because farmers mistreated them, because many of the replacement parts were weaker than the originals. Thinner steel, cheaper castings, sealed systems impossible to repair locally. And buried inside the scrap piles arriving at Eli's shop were the older prototype components Crown had abandoned years earlier because they lasted too long. That was the part nobody knew. The company had quietly killed its strongest designs because durable machines were bad for business. The more Eli discovered, the quieter he became, night after night. Lights stayed on inside the Turner repair shop until morning. He dismantled damaged assemblies piece by piece, cleaned every bearing, restored every usable component, and labeled everything carefully in handwritten notebooks dating back decades. By the spring of 1991, Eli Turner possessed something nobody else in Iowa had anymore: a complete hidden inventory of parts Crown Industrial no longer manufactured. And then the collapse came. It started with rumors, late shipments, missed payroll, dealers complaining about shortages. Then, one Monday morning, the gates of Crown Industrial never opened. Workers arrived before sunrise and found chains wrapped around the entrance fence. Within days, newspapers across Iowa reported the same story. Lawsuits, debt investigations, bank pressure, factory closure. Crown Industrial was finished. The shock hit Millfield like a tornado. Hundreds of farmers suddenly realized the machines they depended on could no longer be repaired. Dealers ran out of replacement parts almost immediately. Service centers stopped answering phones. Harvest season was only weeks away. And expensive combines worth hundreds of thousands of dollars sat useless in barns and fields. Panic spread fast. At diners and grain elevators, people spoke in low, worried voices about losing farms, missing loan payments, and watching entire crops rot before winter. One farmer drove 3 hours searching for a single transmission housing. Another offered cash rewards for discontinued hydraulic valves. Nobody could find anything, because Crown had designed their systems to depend entirely on factory supply chains. And now the factory was dead. But there was one thing the town still didn't know. For nearly 4 years, the company had been dumping thousands of discarded components into Eli Turner's shop. The same old mechanic everyone laughed at, the same man they called outdated. And when the first desperate farmer finally drove to Turner Repair asking for help, Eli disappeared silently into the warehouse behind his shop. A few moments later, he returned carrying the exact replacement part the man had spent 2 weeks searching for. Word spread across the county almost overnight, then across the state. By September, trucks lined both sides of the dirt road outside Eli's property from sunrise until dark. Farmers waited hours just for the chance to speak with him. Some brought broken combines. Others brought transmissions piled in truck beds wrapped beneath dirty tarps. People who once mocked the old repair shop now stood quietly beneath the cold Iowa wind, hoping Eli Turner could save their harvest. And the strangest part of all, he never once said, "I told you so." By October, the Turner Repair Shop no longer looked like a forgotten building at the edge of town. It looked like the center of a war effort. Pickup trucks crowded the roadside before sunrise. Farmers stood drinking cold coffee beside broken combines, while diesel smoke drifted through the frosty morning air. Some men drove from neighboring states after hearing rumors about the old mechanic in Millfield, who somehow still had Crown Industrial parts nobody else could find anymore. Inside the shop, Eli worked without stopping. Grease covered his hands from dawn until midnight. Old country radio played softly in the background, while shelves that once looked like junk slowly revealed themselves to be something far more valuable, a lifeline. And every single day, more people arrived. Some came desperate, some ashamed, some barely able to look Eli in the eye after laughing at him years earlier. But Eli treated all of them the same, quietly, calmly, without bitterness. One afternoon, a young farmer named Daniel Reeves arrived with tears in his eyes after the transmission failed on his combine halfway through harvest. "If I lose this crop," he admitted quietly, "the bank takes everything." Eli listened carefully while removing his gloves. Then he disappeared into the warehouse. For nearly 20 minutes, nobody heard a sound, except distant rain tapping against the roof. Finally, Eli returned carrying a dusty wooden crate marked with faded Crown Industrial lettering. Inside was a complete CX-9 prototype transmission assembly. Daniel stared at it in disbelief. "I thought these never made it into production." "They didn't," Eli replied softly. Then he looked toward the broken combine sitting outside. "But they should have." The repair took almost 6 hours. By sunset, half the town had gathered near the edge of Daniel's soybean field, watching Eli work beneath portable floodlights. Mechanics from nearby dealerships stood nearby, whispering to each other, while Victor Hale watched silently from the back of the crowd, with his hands buried deep inside his coat pockets. For the first time in years, he looked nervous, because he finally understood what Eli had discovered long ago. The strongest machines Crown ever built were the ones the company buried before the public could depend on them. As darkness settled over the field, Eli tightened the final bolts and climbed down from the combine without saying a word. Daniel turned the ignition. At first there was only silence. Then the engine roared to life. Not rough, Not unstable. Smooth. Stronger than anyone expected. The massive combine rolled forward beneath the floodlights, while the entire crowd stood frozen in disbelief. And then came the sound nobody forgot. Applause. Not polite applause. Real applause. The kind that comes from relief more than celebration. Men who had spent months terrified of losing farms suddenly realized they still had a chance. Daniel covered his face with both hands before breaking down completely. Victor Hale never moved. He simply stared at the machine cutting through the field, using a transmission his own company once discarded as worthless. And for the first time in his life, nobody listened to him. Over the next several weeks, the story spread far beyond Millfield. Newspapers called Eli the last real mechanic. Farm journals printed photographs of the crowded repair shop. Even television crews arrived from Des Moines hoping to interview him. But Eli avoided cameras whenever he could. He still lived in the same small farmhouse beside the empty Turner fields, still drove the same rusted pickup truck, still ate lunch sitting alone on an overturned bucket behind the shop. And despite everything that happened, he never used the crisis to make himself rich. That surprised people most of all, because by then, Eli could have charged anything he wanted. Instead, he repaired machines for whatever struggling farmers could afford. Some paid with cash, others brought fuel, tools, labor, or livestock feed in exchange for repairs. One widow whose tractor Eli repaired during winter offered him her wedding ring because she had no money left. Eli gently pushed it back across the table. "Keep it," he told her. "Your husband already paid enough working that land." People remembered moments like that, far more than they remembered the machines. As for Victor Hale, things ended differently after Crown Industrial collapsed. Investigations revealed the company had knowingly abandoned stronger, long-lasting designs to force higher replacement sales. Lawsuits destroyed what remained of the corporation. Executives disappeared into expensive law offices, while towns like Millfield were left dealing with the damage. Victor lost everything: his position, his reputation, even his house. One freezing afternoon in early December, he quietly arrived at Eli's shop alone. No expensive coat anymore, no polished boots, no crowd behind him, just an older man carrying regret heavier than anything in his hands. Eli was repairing an old tractor starter when Victor stepped inside. For several seconds, neither man spoke. Finally, Victor looked around the crowded shelves and shook his head slowly. "All these years," he muttered, "we thought this place was a junkyard." Eli kept working. Victor swallowed hard before speaking again. "I laughed at you." The old mechanic nodded once. "Yes," he said calmly. "You did." Silence filled the room again. Then Victor asked the question that had probably haunted him for months. "Why didn't you throw any of it away?" Eli finally looked up, because his answer had never really been about machinery. "Because somebody built it with pride once," he said quietly, "and I figured someday somebody else might still need it." Victor lowered his eyes after that. He had no response. Years later, after Eli Turner passed away in the winter of 1998, people cleaning the old warehouse discovered thousands of carefully labeled components, still organized across the shelves exactly the way he left them. But they also found something else. Written by hand on a wooden beam near the back wall was a sentence Eli's father had painted decades earlier. "Anything made honestly deserves another chance." The words spread through Millfield almost as quickly as the story itself, and maybe that was why people never forgot Eli Turner. Not because he saved broken machines, but because he lived in a world obsessed with replacing things and still believed some things were worth repairing, including people. Even now, older farmers around Millfield still point toward the abandoned Turner repair shop when they pass that road at sunset. And sooner or later, someone always tells the younger generation the same story about the old mechanic everybody mocked, until the day the entire county realized he had been the only man preparing for the future all along.